Okay, so here we're going to do a little bit of basic basement testing again on a few two-wheel drive buggies. We're going to do my Traxxas RC10, which I haven't run in quite a while, and another run on the Tekin RC10 mid where I made a couple of changes to the rear and the front as far as spring rates and ride height. Because the last time I ran this, when I was testing over jumps, it was a little bouncy, especially at the front. The front was a little too bouncy, so I made a few changes that should make it a little better. So we're going to try that. And then for the RC2, last time I ran this, in anger at least, was at the Vintage Off-Road Nationals in 2019. And when I built it, I had certain ideas about how I was going to set it up to make it corner a little better, but I actually ended up going in the wrong direction. Also, some of the suspension setup at the time that I had, especially at the rear, wasn't that great. The car was slapping the ground quite a lot, so I ended up buying longer rear shocks and changing some of the suspension geometry sort of tricks that I thought would be useful. I basically just changed that back to stock. At the front, I went to a shorter caster angle, so the car came with 30 degrees caster as standard. I think, sorry, no, I had used 30 degree caster blocks at Vonats, and standard it's actually smaller. It might be something like 20 or 15 degrees. So I went back to the stock blocks here to get more steering, because the car was really pushing a lot on the track with all the things that I screwed up on it. So we're going to try this out, and I want to sort of show you guys that this car can actually handle pretty well. And another sort of minor point about running in the classic classes, this car, by the way, it's a plastic tub chassis, so this is meant for the classic class for Vonats, which means you get a Tamiya sport tuned motor, which is a very power limited motor. And because it's a DC motor, you're running a DC speed control. I personally really like the old Novak speed controls. My favorite Novak speed control from back in the 90s is the Novak Tempest, which you can see right here. I have a couple of these. I have a couple I have to rebuild. I really like the speed control because it has very strong brakes. Stronger brakes than any other Novak speed control, at least from the 1990s. And I've noticed that, especially in this car, two-wheel drive car with a weak motor, the Sport Tune motor is pretty weak, you really need strong brakes. I used to have a Novak Racer in here. That was the first speed control that I tried, and the brakes weren't nearly as strong, and also the BEC amperage wasn't high enough. It was like 3 amps, which maybe at the time, back in the 90s, was okay, but this has a 5 amp BEC, which is, more like a modern speed controls. Anyway, enough jibber jabber. Let's just get on with it here. So we're going to plug this in. This battery is fully charged, so I'm not too worried about running the LiPo voltage monitor here. So it should be fine. But normally, if you're going to run a LiPo battery on an old brush motor with an old speed control, you want to have a LiPo voltage monitor on, because these older speed controls don't have voltage cutoff. Okay. So on this RC2, I did a few things to help the car go a bit quicker. I replaced the stock slipper clutch with an A&L hyper, I think it's a hyper clutch. And then I use these molded plastic pinion gears to get less rotational mass. The reason why I wanted to use this type of slipper clutch was because the stock Traxxas slipper clutch with those little sort of eraser-like pads, it wasn't doing a very good job of giving me the right balance of slip and grip, if you will. So I went to this also because this allows me to mount a smaller spur gear. So I can go all the way down to a 69.2 spur gear on this. With the stock unit, you have to use Traxxas spur gears, which don't go down to that small of a value. So when you're running, Sport Tune motor, I tend to want to really overgear them to get more speed, which means I need a smaller spur gear. So I have to use the A&L slipper clutch here. As you can see, it corners perfectly fine, no issues. The rear ride height is a little bit on the tall side. You can see the arms, the rear ass end is kind of up like that, and the arms are kind of down like this. And I've tried to soften the rear to level that out a bit, but that just makes the chassis slap a lot, and really raising the rear like that gives you kind of like a rake angle, like what almost like what F1 does with the higher rear ride height than the front, which does help with steering as well. But overall, it's pretty good. And this jumps and lands way better than my Tamiya Dirt Thrasher, which is my other classic class car. The Dirt Thrasher is punchier off the line, so it's probably faster around a given lap. But in terms of jumping, this is a lot better. This is more like a normal two-wheel drive buggy. It still has some chassis slap issues with the rear especially. But these are not particularly fast cars with these sport tune motors, so you're not losing a whole lot by having that kind of chassis slap, as long as it's not ridiculous. And again, I should run the Dirt Thrasher to show you guys, but the Dirt Thrasher is way worse with chassis slaps. Unbelievable. This drives a lot like, an RC10 or something. It's pretty good. So if you're going to run a two-wheel drive buggy in the classic class, there's really not much point in running a classic RC10 or a low CJRX, because they're not plastic tub chassis. They're graphite or aluminum tub chassis, and so they have other rule restrictions. This has arguably more adjustability than those cars, but because it has a plastic tub chassis, you are afforded more liberties with the kinds of tires you can run, for example. Tires make a much bigger difference than really most everything else in that class. So, not bad. I think I'm going to take this one to Vonats next time around, rather than take the Dirt Thrasher, because I've done the Dirt Thrasher a few times. It's a great car, but I want to give this thing a fair shake, because when I took it last time, I ended up burning out the motor, and I didn't actually get to do like a full race with it. Okay, on to the Tekin mid-motor. So what I did is I added a little bit of preload to the rear to raise the rear ride height, and then on the front I changed the springs, and I also increased the front ride height a bit. So normally at RCE, for the buggies at least, I try to run somewhere around a 20mm ride height or so. On this particular car, if you try to, with the shocks that I'm using, if you try to get to a 20mm ride height, it's no good for jumping performance. You have to go higher than that to get the car to jump and land reasonably well. So that is something of a compromise here with this chassis, and part of that's related to, like in the rear, the geometry of the shocks, and how much droop you can get, perhaps. And then on the front, it's related to the fact that I'm pretty sure I'm using the wrong length shocks. I think I need shorter shocks. But even still, the front on this car is very light, because all the stuff, the electronics, the battery, the servo, everything's all back here. Okay, so in order to get the front to ride low, you need to use a really soft front suspension, just to get it to settle. Okay, so which means, like, just to get it to settle under its own weight, when you set it down like this, you see how it kind of sinks, right? So to get that to sync to a 20 millimeter ride height, there's so little weight here, I'd either have to add a bunch of lead weight, which I don't want to do, or run it really soft. If you run it really soft, you get the ride height that you want, but then it jumps like crap. And then back here is kind of the opposite problem because there's a lot of weight toward the rear of the chassis. So you need to run a little bit stiffer, but then if it's too stiff, then you have other kinds of bouncing issues. So the rear is actually okay. It's really the front here, at the end of the day, that's going to take a bit of tuning. Okay. So we're going to give this a try. Oop, that one's right there. And we'll see how this compares to the last time I ran it. So despite the fact that the way it's set up right now, the front is taller than the rear in ride height. Trying to remember, I think the rear is at around 23 or so right now. The front is way up there. It's in like the mid to high 20s. But it still corners fine. Okay. Let's see how it jumps. See, now it doesn't slap the ground. Again, taller ride height gives you a bit more, taller ride height with more preload makes the suspension kind of a little stiffer. And so it's not going to slap the ground as much. You see it lands quite a bit smoother. It's actually not bad. I kind of like that. It's good enough that I might actually consider running it at Vonats. That's pretty good. This is a very quirky car, I gotta admit, but it's neat. It's kind of interesting. Oopsies. I'm getting a little too excited there. Alright. So I would say, at least as far as getting an initial setup is concerned, you know, this car is pretty good to go. Again, the whole point of this whole basement testing series isn't to just like, you know, make a video for each car just to show it running for a little bit. It's just to kind of demonstrate how doing simple testing, like first order testing at home, can save you a lot of trouble down the line when you actually get to the racetrack. You know, you want to try to work out as many kinks as possible at home. It doesn't take that long, couple of minutes with a little jump setup, and you can do just really basic testing, and it can save you a ton of time. So that's what I'm trying to emphasize here with these videos. And yes, you do get to see some of these nifty looking cars running when you otherwise might not be able to. Anyway, that covers it for these two. I think next I got my RC10T and my Kyosho Pro XRT. I want to show you guys those in the next video. So thanks for watching.